She told 150 realtors my private ranch was reserved for their party. But when she showed up with her army, I locked the gate, called the cops, and watched her empire crumble. The story began on a crisp spring morning in the countryside, where the air was filled with the earthy scent of dew settling over rolling acres of green pasture. The ranch sat proudly at the edge of town, an expanse of open land dotted with stables, barns, and white-fenced pastures stretching as far as the eye could see. For years, it had been my sanctuary, an escape from the relentless noise of suburban developments and HOA boards that always seemed to creep closer with each passing year. Life on the ranch was simple but busy. There were horses to care for, fences to mend, and the constant upkeep that came with managing several acres of land. The ranch wasn't just a property, it was a way of life. Family gatherings had been held under its massive oak trees. Small community events occasionally took place in its open fields, and on quiet nights, the stars stretched endlessly overhead, reminding me why I had fought so hard to preserve this land. But peace never lasts long when an HOA Karen believes she holds authority everywhere she steps. It started innocently enough, at least on the surface. A week before the chaos unfolded, a neatly folded flyer appeared in my mailbox. The paper was glossy, covered in bright colors, and bore the logo of a local real estate firm. It was advertising a special realtor appreciation event, meant to bring together more than 100 agents from across the county. The event promised catered food, live music, and property showcases. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just another industry mixer. The problem was the location listed on the flyer, my ranch. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely they hadn't meant to print my address on official materials without speaking to me. Yet as I read further, the details were unmistakable. The flyer mentioned ample parking in the south pasture, barn tours available for groups, and even sunset cocktails by the stables. These weren't vague descriptions. They were direct references to features of my property. My ranch had been chosen, without my consent, as the venue for this massive gathering. The name attached to the event was one I unfortunately knew all too well: Karen, the self-proclaimed community liaison of the HOA that governed the new subdivision just a mile down the road. Over the years, she had made repeated attempts to extend the HOA's reach beyond its designated boundaries, often sending letters implying that my ranch should adhere to community standards or that I ought to voluntarily comply with HOA landscaping rules. Each attempt had been firmly ignored, and each time Karen seemed to grow bolder. This, however, was different. This wasn't a suggestion or a passive-aggressive letter. This was a full-blown claim of ownership, a public announcement that my ranch was hers to use as she pleased. For the next few days, I monitored the situation, hoping it might resolve itself. Perhaps Karen would realize her mistake or quietly cancel the event. But instead, the opposite occurred. More flyers began circulating. Social media posts appeared, tagging the ranch and promoting the gathering as a can't-miss industry event. People began calling me directly, asking about parking, vendors, and schedules. Each time I had to explain that my ranch was not open to the public, that there had been no agreement, and that the event had been advertised under false pretenses. The final straw came when I spotted Karen herself on my property. I was out near the north fence line repairing a section of wire that had come loose when I noticed her car parked boldly by the front gate. She was pacing the driveway, phone in hand, gesturing toward the barns as though she were giving a virtual tour. Though I stayed out of sight, the sight of her waltzing onto my land without permission hardened my resolve. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act. By midweek, confirmations were pouring in online. More than 150 realtors had RSVP'd to attend. Caterers were boasting about preparing for a large-scale outdoor banquet. A local band even tagged the ranch in a post, claiming they couldn't wait to perform under the stars at the most beautiful venue in town. The nerve of it all was astounding. My private sanctuary was being transformed, on paper at least, into a commercial party ground, all orchestrated by Karen. The day before the event, I made my decision. If they wanted to treat my land as though it belonged to them, they were going to be in for a rude awakening. I drove into town and purchased heavy-duty chains and locks for the gates. Every entry point to the ranch, from the main drive to the smaller service entrances, would be secured. Signs were placed prominently. Private property. No trespassing. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed. I knew it would cause a scene, and part of me dreaded the inevitable confrontation. Yet another part of me, the part that had endured years of Karen's entitlement, felt a sharp sense of satisfaction. This was my land, my rules, and if Karen wanted a war over boundaries, I was ready. The morning of the supposed event dawned bright and clear. The sun glinted off the dew-covered grass, birdsong filled the air, and for a moment everything felt calm. But as the hours passed, the rumble of engines grew louder. Car after car began appearing on the narrow country road, each one slowing as its driver realized the gates were chained shut. Realtors in suits and dresses stepped out of their vehicles, checking their phones, confusion spreading across their faces. Some tried calling numbers on their invitations. Others simply stood at the gate, peering in as though the party might magically appear if they waited long enough. Then came Karen. Dressed sharply in heels far too impractical for gravel driveways, she stormed out of her SUV and marched straight to the locked gate. Her expression was a mix of fury and disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend that her grand plans had been thwarted. Within minutes, she was surrounded by dozens of frustrated realtors, all demanding answers. The scene quickly devolved into chaos, voices rising, cars blocking the road, vendors arriving with nowhere to unload. I watched from a distance, my phone in hand. The moment I saw Karen grab the lock as if she had the right to remove it, I dialed the sheriff's department. If ever there was a time to draw a line in the sand, this was it. And as the sound of sirens began faintly echoing in the distance, I knew the real story was only just beginning. The ranch had always been quiet, the kind of place where the loudest sound might be the wind rushing through the pastures or the distant whinny of a horse. That morning, however, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The once calm country road leading up to my locked gates had transformed into a crowded scene of frustration, confusion, and mounting anger. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, the situation had grown tense. Cars were lined up for nearly half a mile, clogging the narrow road. Realtors in pressed suits stood outside, fanning themselves in the late morning sun, while vendors tried to navigate trailers of equipment and food that had nowhere to go. The locked gates, with their new chains and bold no trespassing signs, stood as an immovable wall between them and what they believed was their reserved venue. When the first patrol car pulled up, lights flashing, a ripple moved through the crowd. Some of the realtors appeared relieved, thinking the authorities had come to solve their problem and grant them access. Others looked wary, sensing trouble. But one person seemed absolutely certain of the outcome: Karen. She marched toward the deputies with the confidence of someone who believed the entire world bent to her will. From my vantage point near the barn, I could see her gesturing animatedly, pointing toward the ranch as if it were her property. Her arms moved in wide arcs, her expression painted with indignation. The deputies listened carefully, one taking notes while the other kept his eyes on the crowd, ensuring things didn't spiral out of control. When Karen finally finished her tirade, I stepped forward. The time for hiding in the background was over. This was my land, my gates, my decision to call the authorities. I approached the deputies calmly, holding a folder of documents that proved, beyond any doubt, that I owned the ranch outright, and that no contracts or agreements existed allowing an event on the property. The deputies listened as I laid out the situation. I explained how flyers had been circulated without my permission, how social media posts had promoted the ranch as a venue, and how Karen had taken it upon herself to claim my land as the setting for an event that was never authorized. My words were measured, but my tone carried the weight of weeks of frustration. As I spoke, the crowd grew restless. Realtors pulled out their phones, showing invitations and digital confirmations, demanding to know how such a mistake could happen. Vendors complained about wasted resources, some already unloading items in the hope that the matter would be resolved in their favor. The tension thickened with every passing minute, voices overlapping until the deputies had to raise their hands for quiet. It was then that Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down or admitting her role in the debacle, she doubled down. Loud enough for everyone to hear, she insisted that she had reserved the ranch on behalf of the community and that my refusal to honor the reservation was a violation of some imagined responsibility. Her words carried the unmistakable tone of entitlement, as if ownership, consent, and legality were meaningless obstacles in the face of her desires. The deputies glanced at each other, their expressions betraying the disbelief they must have felt. One of them calmly asked Karen for proof of her supposed reservation. That was when the entire facade began to crumble. She produced no signed contract, no receipt, no written permission. All she had were her words and a stack of printed flyers she had apparently designed and distributed herself. The crowd's reaction was swift. Murmurs spread, then sharp voices cut through the air as realtors realized they had been misled. Some turned on Karen immediately, demanding explanations, accusing her of wasting their time, damaging their reputations, and costing them money. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, distancing themselves from the chaos as quickly as possible. Through it all, I remained silent, letting the truth unfold naturally. The deputies did their job, making it clear to everyone present that the ranch was private property and that no one had the right to be there without my permission. The gates would remain locked. The event was canceled, but Karen was not one to concede defeat gracefully. Her voice rose above the crowd, shrill and insistent, claiming I was ruining the community spirit and embarrassing the entire county. She accused me of being hostile, selfish, even unpatriotic. It was a spectacle, one that might have been comical if not for the very real disruption she had caused. The deputies, clearly growing tired of her theatrics, warned her to calm down. When she refused, they pulled her aside, speaking to her firmly out of the earshot of the crowd. Though I couldn't hear the words exchanged, the change in her demeanor was obvious. Her shoulders stiffened. Her face reddened, and for the first time, she looked less like a queen holding court and more like someone realizing the consequences of her actions. By early afternoon, the road began to clear. Cars turned around one by one, vendors packed up their supplies, and the disappointed realtors dispersed, their conversations filled with frustration and disbelief. The band that had been scheduled to play arrived late, only to find an empty road and a canceled event. Within hours, the grand spectacle Karen had promised had dissolved into nothing more than a costly embarrassment. The deputies left after giving me assurances that the matter would be documented. They reminded Karen, in no uncertain terms, that trespassing laws applied to everyone, regardless of community status or perceived authority. As they drove away, the ranch finally grew quiet again, though the tension lingered in the air like the aftermath of a storm. I walked the perimeter, checking the gates, making sure every lock was secure. Though the immediate crisis had passed, I knew Karen well enough to understand this wasn't the end. She had invested too much of her ego into the event, and humiliation was not something she handled well. There would be fallout, whether through complaints to the county, slander online, or more underhanded attempts to undermine me. Sure enough, that very evening, social media lit up. Posts began circulating, painting me as the villain. Karen had wasted no time spinning the story, claiming I had canceled at the last minute and left hundreds of professionals stranded. She framed herself as the victim of an unreasonable landowner who refused to support the community. While some people believed her version of events, many others had witnessed the truth firsthand and were quick to push back. The comment sections turned into battlegrounds, with accusations and defenses flying back and forth. For my part, I chose not to engage. The ranch was mine, the law was on my side, and the people who mattered most, the deputies, the realtors who had been deceived, and the community beyond Karen's influence, knew the truth. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was only the opening chapter of a much larger conflict. Karen had embarrassed herself publicly, but her type never retreated quietly. She would regroup, scheme, and return with even greater determination to assert control. And as I watched the sun set over the pastures that evening, I prepared myself for the battles yet to come. The ranch had survived the first wave of intrusion, but Karen wasn't finished. And I had the uneasy sense that the next move she made would test not only my patience, but the very future of the land I called home. The days following the failed realtor event were strangely quiet, but the silence carried a weight I recognized. It wasn't peace, it was the stillness before another storm. Karen had been humiliated, not just in front of her neighbors, but in front of an entire professional circle. 150 realtors had seen her authority unravel, and dozens more vendors had suffered losses because of her reckless arrogance. People like Karen didn't forget public embarrassment. They plotted. At first, her retaliation came in whispers. I began receiving letters in the mail, each one more ridiculous than the last. They bore the official letterhead of the HOA subdivision down the road, though my ranch had never been under their jurisdiction. The first letter claimed that my unkempt fences violated community standards. Another demanded that I submit an event hosting application to the HOA for future gatherings. The most absurd accused me of creating a traffic hazard on the day of the canceled event, as though the chaos had been my fault. Each letter went straight into a folder I kept specifically for HOA nonsense. Over the years, Karen and her allies had tried countless times to rope me into their web of control, but this was the most aggressive campaign yet. I refused to respond, knowing that any acknowledgement would only feed her delusions of authority. Still, I documented everything carefully. Experience had taught me that paper trails mattered. While the letters piled up, Karen launched a social media crusade. Every day she posted on local community boards, painting herself as a martyr. According to her version of events, she had secured a wonderful venue for a community-building realtor showcase, only to have me cancel at the last second out of spite. She framed me as hostile, anti-community, and even dangerous, claiming that the sheriff's deputies had been called because I was threatening. Some people bought into her narrative, but others pushed back, pointing out the obvious holes in her story. Realtors who had attended the fiasco spoke openly about how they'd been misled. Vendors confirmed that no contracts existed with the ranch. Slowly, the truth chipped away at Karen's fabricated version of events, but the damage was already spreading. By the end of the week, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail, this time from the county zoning office. Inside was a notice informing me that a complaint had been filed against the ranch, alleging that I was operating as an unlicensed event venue. My heart sank as I read the words. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. Karen had escalated her campaign into official channels. The complaint triggered an inspection. A zoning officer arrived at the ranch one afternoon, clipboard in hand, explaining that they had received multiple reports of the property being used for large-scale gatherings. I walked him through the barns, the pastures, the empty eventless grounds. I explained the realtor debacle, showed him the flyers, and handed over the stack of HOA letters I had saved. He listened patiently, jotting down notes, and finally assured me that the complaint appeared baseless. Still, it was a reminder that Karen was willing to weaponize bureaucracy to get what she wanted. The following weekend, another wave hit. I woke early to the sound of cars idling near the front gate. When I stepped outside, I saw a group of people gathered, holding clipboards and wearing determined expressions. They were canvassing the area, going door to door in the nearby subdivision, collecting signatures for a petition. Later, I learned that Karen was spearheading an initiative to have the county rezone the ranch as a shared community resource. Her plan was to argue that the land could be better used as a recreational park, an event space, or even potential development for the growing subdivision. The audacity of it all was staggering. My private ranch, land that had been in my family for generations, was now being targeted by an HOA crusade masquerading as community activism. It was during this time that the sheriff's office reached out again. A deputy I recognized from the realtor fiasco called to inform me that they'd been receiving repeated complaints about suspicious activity at the ranch. Each time, the calls had come from the same neighborhood. And each time, the supposed suspicious activity turned out to be nothing more than me living my normal life, repairing fences, loading hay, or exercising the horses. The deputy made it clear that they were obligated to follow up on the complaints, but admitted, with some frustration, that it seemed like targeted harassment. Karen wasn't just trying to control the ranch anymore. She was trying to wear me down, to bury me in stress, paperwork, and scrutiny until I either gave up or made a mistake she could exploit. Yet despite the mounting pressure, I refused to back down. Instead, I doubled my efforts to document everything. I installed additional cameras at the gates, set up motion-activated lights near the barns, and kept detailed logs of every letter, every inspection, every visit from the county. If Karen wanted a war, I would fight it with evidence, patience, and the law on my side. But Karen had one more card to play, and it came in the form of a meeting. Late one evening, a neighbor from the subdivision knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as he explained why he was there. The HOA had held a special meeting, led by Karen, and during that meeting, she had made an announcement. According to her, the HOA board was preparing to formally request that the county annex my ranch into their jurisdiction. If successful, it would mean that my land, despite its distance from the subdivision and its long-standing independence, would fall under the HOA's control. The neighbor admitted that not everyone in the subdivision supported the idea, but Karen was persuasive, and she had managed to rally a significant group of homeowners behind her cause. She framed it as a way to elevate property values, increase community unity, and prevent dangerous misuse of the ranch. Her words had swayed more people than I would have believed possible. As my neighbor spoke, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was an organized campaign, one that threatened the very autonomy of my ranch. If the HOA succeeded in annexing my property, everything would change. Every decision, from the paint color of the barn to whether I could host a family barbecue, would be subject to their rules and whims. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread across the surface, trying to piece together a strategy. The law was on my side, but I knew from experience that persistence and manipulation could sometimes bend reality in unexpected ways. Karen was determined, and she thrived on creating chaos until people gave in just to make her stop. As the clock ticked past midnight, one thought anchored me. The ranch was more than just land. It was history. It was freedom. It was a sanctuary that I had no intention of surrendering. Karen's retaliation had escalated beyond anything I had imagined, but the fight was far from over. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the fields, I made a silent vow. If Karen wanted to drag this battle into county meetings, courtrooms, and public opinion, then so be it. I would be ready. The storm Karen had been building finally broke with the county's announcement. A notice appeared in the local paper and on the county website. A petition had been filed requesting the annexation of my ranch into the jurisdiction of the neighboring HOA subdivision. The petition, signed by dozens of homeowners, argued that bringing the ranch under HOA oversight was necessary for community safety, cohesion, and property value stability. It was written in careful, formal language, but I recognized Karen's fingerprints all over it. For most people, annexation was a distant, bureaucratic concept, something that happened in city planning offices, not in small rural communities, but for me it was personal. If successful, the annexation would mean the HOA could enforce their endless rules and restrictions on my land. It would mean no freedom, no privacy, and constant harassment disguised as community standards. The ranch would no longer be mine in spirit, even if the deed still bore my name. The county scheduled a public hearing. It would be held at the courthouse downtown, open to anyone who wanted to speak for or against the petition. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, tensions in the community reached a boiling point. Karen went on a full-blown campaign. She knocked on doors in the subdivision, passing out glossy pamphlets that portrayed the ranch as a liability. The images showed pictures of the Realtor fiasco, spun to look like a dangerous, unregulated gathering. She claimed the ranch attracted rowdy crowds and created traffic jams that endangered families. She even implied that my stables and barns were unsanitary and a threat to nearby property values. Meanwhile, social media became a battlefield. Every day, new posts popped up on community boards. Karen's allies praised her efforts to bring order to the area, while others accused her of overreach and bullying. My inbox filled with messages of support from neighbors who valued the ranch's history, alongside anonymous emails calling me selfish, outdated, and unwilling to adapt. Through it all, I stayed focused. I gathered every document I could find: property records, county maps, zoning laws, and evidence of the harassment campaign. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, and together we built a case. The lawyer explained that annexation wasn't simple. It required strong legal grounds and usually the consent of the landowner. Still, the fact that the petition had made it this far meant I couldn't take it lightly. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud. The courthouse steps were crowded long before the session began. Homeowners from the subdivision gathered in groups, whispering and pointing, while ranchers and townsfolk who supported me stood nearby, their expressions firm and protective. Reporters hovered at the edges, sensing a story that had outgrown neighborhood squabbles. Inside, the hearing room was packed. The county commissioners sat at the front, their expressions neutral as they prepared to listen. Karen sat in the front row, her posture rigid, a binder of papers in her lap. She looked every bit the self-appointed savior, ready to argue her case with righteous fury. When the session began, Karen was among the first to speak. Her voice carried across the room, polished and rehearsed. She spoke of community harmony, of shared responsibility, and of the dangers of unchecked property use. She painted the ranch as a ticking time bomb, an unregulated space that threatened the safety and prosperity of everyone nearby. Her words dripped with false concern, masking the personal vendetta that fueled her campaign. One by one, her allies took the podium. They echoed her points, each adding their own twist. One claimed the ranch created dust that drifted into their yards. Another insisted the traffic from the Realtor event had traumatized her children. A third spoke dramatically about strange lights on the ranch at night, implying some kind of illicit activity. The exaggerations piled up until the picture they painted bore no resemblance to reality. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, carrying a stack of documents. The room quieted as I began to speak. My voice was steady, not theatrical, but every word carried weight. I explained the history of the ranch, its long-standing independence from the subdivision, and its lawful use as private agricultural property. I presented deeds, maps, and zoning documents proving that the ranch lay well outside the HOA's jurisdiction. I reminded the commissioners and everyone listening that the Realtor fiasco had not been my doing. I had never agreed to host the event, never signed a contract, never profited from it. I had been the victim of Karen's overreach, and when I protected my property, I had done so within my legal rights. As I spoke, I saw the shift in the room. Some commissioners nodded, their expressions softening. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even a few subdivision homeowners glanced at each other, realizing the weakness of Karen's case, but Karen couldn't stand being challenged. She leapt to her feet, interrupting me, insisting that I was lying, that I had secretly agreed to host the event before backing out. The commissioners banged their gavel, demanding order, but Karen pressed on, her voice rising until it cracked. Her polished veneer slipped, and the entitled fury beneath was laid bare. When the commissioners finally regained control, they asked direct questions. Did Karen have any written proof of her claims? Any contracts? Any legal agreements? The answer, of course, was no. All she had were her flyers, her words, and her self-proclaimed authority. By the end of the session, the outcome was clear. The commissioners announced that the petition for annexation was denied. The ranch would remain independent. The HOA had no legal claim, no jurisdiction, and no authority to enforce rules on my property. The room erupted. My supporters clapped and cheered, relief etched across their faces. Karen's faction muttered angrily, some storming out in protest. Karen herself sat frozen, her face pale, her binder clutched tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Outside, the courthouse steps became a stage. Reporters crowded in, asking questions, snapping photos, capturing the clash of two worlds, freedom versus control, individual rights versus collective overreach. I declined interviews, choosing instead to quietly thank my neighbors who had stood by me. The victory was real, but I knew better than to believe the battle was over. Karen's defeat at the hearing was decisive, but humiliation only fueled her obsession. That night, her social media lit up with accusations of corruption, conspiracies, and betrayal. She claimed the commissioners had been bribed, that I had threatened witnesses, and that the entire process had been rigged. Her words grew more desperate, her tone more erratic. For the first time, some of her allies began to distance themselves. They had joined her crusade believing it was about community improvement. But now they saw the truth. It was about Karen's ego, her need for control, and her inability to accept limits. Still, I remained cautious. Karen wasn't done. People like her never admitted defeat. They regrouped, shifted tactics, and found new ways to strike. The annexation attempt had failed, but in its failure, she had lost face, lost credibility, and lost the illusion of authority she had worked so hard to build. And in the void left by that loss, desperation would take root. The ranch was safe for now. But as I walked the fence line that evening, listening to the quiet hum of crickets and watching the sun sink behind the hills, I couldn't shake the sense that the true storm hadn't yet arrived. Karen had been cornered, and a cornered Karen was dangerous. For a few brief weeks, the ranch was calm again. The failed annexation attempt had struck a heavy blow to Karen's campaign, and the subdivision seemed quieter, almost embarrassed by the spectacle she had created. I used that time to catch up on repairs around the property, to tend to the animals, and to breathe without feeling like the weight of an HOA witch hunt pressed against my chest. But deep down, I knew it was only a pause. Karen's silence wasn't surrender. It was plotting. The first sign came in the form of a phone call from the sheriff's office. Once again, complaints had been filed. According to the reports, there were suspicious gatherings happening on the ranch late at night. Allegations ranged from illegal parties to hazardous chemical storage. Each complaint was anonymous, but the deputies didn't need to tell me who was behind them. The pattern was obvious. The deputies came out to investigate, apologetic but bound by procedure. I showed them the barns, the equipment, the feed, and the horses, just as I had during the zoning inspection weeks earlier. They took notes, snapped photos, and left with the same conclusion as always. The complaints were baseless. Still, each visit chipped away at my time, my peace, and my patience. Then came the vandalism. One morning, I discovered the front gate spray-painted with crude messages. Words like community property and HOA rules apply were scrawled in dripping red letters across the wood. It was childish, but it was also a message, a warning that Karen's battle was far from over. I replaced the gate sign, installed more cameras, and notified the sheriff's office again. The deputies documented it, but without catching someone in the act, there was little they could do. That was the frustrating genius of Karen's tactics. She operated in the gray spaces between laws, pushing boundaries just far enough to cause chaos without leaving direct evidence. The following week, the harassment escalated. Trucks began showing up at odd hours, pulling into the driveway, idling for a few minutes, then speeding away. Once I caught a group of teenagers trespassing near the stables, claiming they'd been told the ranch was open for community use. They bolted when I confronted them, leaving behind empty cans of spray paint. It became clear that Karen was spreading lies again, this time on a local level. Rumors circulated that the ranch was in legal limbo, that the annexation had technically passed, and that I was refusing to comply. Some even said the county had seized part of the land for public access. None of it was true, but rumors spread faster than truth, and soon I was fielding phone calls from strangers asking about park hours and event bookings. The breaking point came one Saturday evening. I was finishing up in the barn when headlights appeared on the road. A caravan of vehicles, SUVs, sedans, even a catering truck, rolled up to the gate and stopped. Dozens of people began piling out, dressed in semi-formal clothes, carrying coolers and folding chairs. Confused, I approached cautiously, staying on my side of the locked gate. That's when I realized what was happening. Karen had organized another event. Not as large as the Realtor fiasco, but significant enough to cause trouble. This time, it appeared to be some kind of HOA celebration, complete with decorations, tables, and music equipment. I locked eyes with Karen as she stepped out of her car. She wore the same smug smile she had displayed before the county hearing, as though nothing had happened, as though the law itself couldn't touch her. She barked orders to the others, instructing them to set up inside the ranch. When they reached the locked gate, she waved dismissively, claiming she had keys and that access was only a matter of time. But this time, I was ready. I pulled out my phone and began recording. Every vehicle, every person, every action, they were all documented. I called the sheriff's office again, my voice steady as I explained the trespassing attempt. The crowd grew restless as the deputies arrived. Some of the attendees had no idea they were trespassing. They looked confused, embarrassed even, as they realized the truth. Others grew angry, blaming me for ruining the evening. But when the deputies questioned Karen, the story unraveled once again. She had told them the ranch was available, that I had agreed, and that it was all perfectly legal. The deputies weren't buying it. Not after the realtor fiasco, not after the annexation attempt, and not after months of baseless complaints. They ordered everyone to leave, warning Karen that any further attempts to claim my land would result in criminal charges. For the first time, Karen's confidence cracked. Her face turned red, her words stumbled, and she shouted accusations about conspiracies and corruption as her so-called guests packed up their cars. Within an hour, the road was clear again, the only evidence of the attempted event being tire tracks in the gravel and a scattering of discarded flyers. That night, I sat on the porch, exhausted but resolute. The fight with Karen had reached a new level, one where her desperation was visible for all to see. She had lost credibility, lost allies, and now faced the very real possibility of legal consequences. But even in her defeat, I sensed danger. Desperate people don't give up. They lash out. And Karen was more desperate than ever. The following morning confirmed my fears. A certified letter arrived, delivered by courier. Inside was a formal notice. Karen had filed a lawsuit. The document accused me of defamation, obstruction of community development, and willful harm to property values. It demanded damages, compliance with HOA rules, and even, outrageously, the transfer of partial control of the ranch to the HOA board. It was laughable on its face, but it wasn't a joke. Lawsuits meant courtrooms, expenses, and time. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was war through legal means. I handed the papers to my lawyer, who shook his head in disbelief. He assured me the case was weak, built on lies and half-truths, but it would still take months to resolve. During that time, Karen would use the lawsuit as another weapon, spinning the story to anyone who would listen, framing herself as the victim of an unjust landowner who refused to cooperate with the greater good. And so, the battle lines hardened. The ranch was no longer just my sanctuary. It was the center of a conflict that had captured the attention of the entire county. Neighbors whispered about it at grocery stores, reporters called for interviews, and social media boiled with arguments. Some people saw me as a defender of individual rights. Others, manipulated by Karen's rhetoric, saw me as a selfish obstructionist standing in the way of progress. As the weeks wore on, the pressure mounted. The lawsuit loomed, the harassment continued, and the ranch felt less like a refuge and more like a fortress under siege. Yet through it all, one truth remained clear in my mind. I would not surrender. Karen had taken everything to the edge: vandalism, lies, trespassing, even legal warfare. But the ranch had survived every attack, and so had I. The question was no longer whether I could withstand her schemes. The question was how far she was willing to go, and whether her final act of desperation would cross a line she could never come back from. The answer came sooner than I expected. And when it did, it changed everything. The ranch had always been my home, my sanctuary, the one place I could breathe freely. But by the time Karen's lawsuit wound its way through the legal system, the ranch no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like the front line of a war. Every creak of the gate, every unexpected sound outside at night, it all set my nerves on edge. The cameras, the locks, Even the dogs had become part of a defensive routine because Karen had proven time and again that she didn't respect boundaries. The court dates came and went. My lawyer dismantled her arguments with ease, pointing out the contradictions, the lack of evidence, and the outright lies. The judge dismissed the most outrageous claims early on, but Karen kept pressing, dragging out the process as long as she could. In the end, the lawsuit collapsed completely. Not only was her case thrown out, but she was warned by the judge about abusing the legal system for personal vendettas. It should have been the end. For most people, it would have been. But Karen was not most people. Losing in court didn't break her. It fueled her. The humiliation of standing in a courtroom watching her arguments unravel burned into her pride like acid. And when people like Karen are humiliated, they don't retreat quietly. They double down. The final act began one humid summer evening. I was inside the house finishing dinner when the sound of engines carried across the fields. At first, I thought it was another passing group of trucks, the kind that sometimes rumbled along the county road. But these engines didn't fade. They grew louder, closer, until headlights appeared through the trees. I stepped outside, phone in hand, and saw them, a convoy. Not of cars for a party, not of teenagers sneaking around, but of pickup trucks loaded with tools, lumber, and what looked like construction equipment. At least a dozen vehicles, all pulling up to the gate as though they had every right to be there. And at the head of it all, standing in the bed of one of the trucks like a general before battle, was Karen. She had a bullhorn in one hand, papers in the other, and a determined fire in her eyes. This wasn't another social event or a petty stunt. This was an invasion. Through the bullhorn, she announced that the ranch was now community property, citing emergency provisions of HOA bylaws. It was nonsense, legally meaningless, but she shouted it with such confidence that some of the people behind her seemed convinced. They began unloading supplies, setting up sawhorses, as if they planned to build something right then and there. I locked the gate and called the sheriff, my voice calm but firm. I had dealt with Karen enough times to know that panic was exactly what she wanted. While I waited for deputies, I turned on every floodlight along the fence line. The ranch lit up like a stage, and Karen and her followers became the actors of their own downfall. The deputies arrived quickly this time, sirens cutting through the humid night. They pulled up, lights flashing, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Karen, still waving her papers, tried to argue that the sheriff's office had no authority, that this was a civil matter under HOA jurisdiction. The deputies weren't having it. They ordered her people to stop unloading equipment, warning them that trespassing charges would be filed if they crossed onto my land. For the first time, Karen's followers hesitated. Some of them had come under the impression this was legitimate, that the HOA had somehow gained rights to the ranch. But as the deputies laid out the reality, that this was private land, not subject to HOA rules, the crowd began to scatter. Trucks started backing out, drivers shaking their heads, muttering curses about being misled. Karen, however, refused to back down. She screamed about conspiracies, about corrupt sheriffs, about shadow deals between me and the county. She waved her papers in the air until the deputies confiscated them, revealing nothing more than printed HOA bylaws and scribbled notes. Her voice cracked as she shouted into the night, demanding someone listen, someone believe her, someone give her control. But no one did. The deputies warned her one final time, leave now or be arrested. And then, in a moment that felt like the collapse of everything she had built, Karen made her choice. She climbed down from the truck bed, shoved past the deputies, and tried to force the gate open with her bare hands. When that failed, she picked up a rock and struck the padlock. That was it. The deputies moved in, handcuffed her, and led her to the squad car. She kicked, she screamed, she called for the neighbors who had already driven away. But it was over. The self-declared queen of the HOA, the woman who had tried to seize my land through lies, intimidation, and manipulation, was finally silenced by the weight of her own actions. As the convoy dispersed and the flashing lights faded, I stood alone at the gate, exhausted but relieved. The war was over, not with a bang, not with a courtroom victory, but with the inevitable collapse of a bully who had pushed too far for too long. In the days that followed, the subdivision was quiet. The HOA board distanced themselves from Karen, some even resigning in embarrassment. Neighbors who had once sided with her came forward, apologizing for believing her lies. The vandalism stopped. The complaints stopped. For the first time in months, the ranch felt like a home again, not a battlefield. Karen faced multiple charges: trespassing, vandalism, attempted property damage, and though the legal system would take time to process them, she no longer held any power. Her name, once spoken with fear and authority in the subdivision, became a cautionary tale. The woman who tried to control everything had lost everything, and me? I finally had peace. I repaired the gate once more, planted new grass over the ruts left by the convoy, and returned to the rhythm of ranch life. The animals needed care, the fields needed tending, and the sunsets once again felt like mine to enjoy. The fight with Karen had been long, exhausting, and sometimes frightening. But it had also taught me something vital. Boundaries matter, not just on property lines, but in life. Some people will always try to take, to control, to manipulate. The only way to stop them is to stand firm, to defend what's yours, and to never let fear dictate your choices. Karen's downfall wasn't just about an HOA or a ranch. It was about what happens when entitlement meets resistance. She believed she could bend reality to her will, that rules applied to everyone but her. And in the end, that belief destroyed her. As summer turned to autumn, the ranch grew quieter still. The lawsuits were gone, the HOA threats silenced, the community finally free of Karen's shadow. I walked the land one evening, listening to the crickets, the wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension in my chest. The war was over. The ranch was mine, and Karen was nothing more than a memory, a story neighbors whispered about, a lesson carved into the history of the subdivision. And as I closed the gate behind me that night, locking it with steady hands, I knew one thing for certain. It would stay mine, no matter who tried to claim it. And that brings us to the end of this story. A battle with an HOA Karen that started with trespassing and ended with handcuffs. At the end of the day, it proved one thing. When you stand your ground, even the loudest bully can be silenced. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.